This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled The Toughest Concepts in Web Development. We should put some reverb or something on that. Web development. But anyway, what we're going to be talking today about is a few topics that Mike has brought up that he thinks are some of the toughest things, such as state management, asynchronous programming and promises, performance optimization, cross-browser compatibility, and many, many more. In fact, there's approximately 12, we may not get to all of them, but approximately 12 different things that he's mentioned here. And if you listen to the Twitter space, we have a pre-show now. We do so right before we record the podcast. Of course, when we record, it takes 2 weeks for the episode approximately to come out. But we do have a pre-show on X now. So go subscribe to that. Go follow Mike on there at HTML Everything. But basically, we had a brief discussion on how we're going to talk about these things, these topics, which are more so like, hey, programming is hard. If I were to like high level it, right? Really high level, kind of one statement it. And then I kind of bringing in some comments on, hey, this is hard. And it's also way out of the realm of the client who's non-technical. So how do you describe to them that this thing that, just makes their site load a little faster is actually not easy, even though it's completely obfuscated and completely out of their wheelhouse. So we're going to talk a little bit about that where applicable. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. Mike, you wrote this episode. You chose the toughest concepts in web development. Please, sir, take it away.
So I think just to back up a little bit, I feel like I say that every episode, but introduction to this, right? Web development is typically considered an easier field versus like mobile app development. I think embedded programming, definitely maybe some server infrastructure stuff. I feel like web development is considered to be like this is the easier path that people can take. I don't think that's very accurate, but to be fair to that side, there are some things in web development that are easier. Rapid prototyping, being able to save and see your changes on a website is really, really nice compared to rebuilding an application, seeing it on a device like that. That whole part of web development is great. There's a lot of really sophisticated development tools that make it easier for us to develop on the web. There's tons of learning resources just due to the sheer amount of developers developing for the web. There's a lot more resources for people to learn, and there's a lot more debugging material. There's a lot more, Stack Overflow stuff for web developers. That makes it a little bit easier as well. But having said that, there's also a ton of really difficult stuff that the web has to deal with because of its kind of general purpose nature, right? Like web development, I feel like fits into every category at this point. Like everyone's trying to do everything on the web. And because of that, it's become difficult to do certain things. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the hardest concepts in web development. And I'm going to just dive right into that right now, with the first one being asynchronous programming and promises. I feel like this was my first actual struggle with web development back in the day, where I was just going through and just coding, and I knew, I write a line of code, it runs, and then the next line goes and it runs, and it happens one line at a time, top to bottom. And then I would run into something like a promise, right? And the complication there is essentially it doesn't run at the same exact time in the same spot where you write it. So if you write like something above it, a promise, and then something below it, the reality is that promise is probably going to run. And I say probably because it's indeterministic. It's probably going to run sometime after the line below it. It can run before it, but it can run below it. So you have to account for that. And that makes it kind of complicated. Like that makes development in general complicated. JavaScript in general is single threaded, meaning it runs when you write traditional JavaScript without any sort of web workers and stuff like that, it'll run on one thread on your processor, one CPU core, right? Whatever you want to call it. But a lot of times, if you're writing asynchronous JavaScript, it will all of a sudden become multi-threaded. It will all of a sudden become like this really tough to put together abstraction of what's going on during the timeline of what when your code is running. For instance, JavaScript heavily relies on loading APIs, right? Like you're constantly talking to third-party data providers. And most of the time when you're talking to third-party data providers, you're going to use something like an async await, right? Or a regular promise, which is something that will query the data. That data can take 1 millisecond, 30 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds. It doesn't matter. And then eventually an event will come back and say that data is done, right? And there's multiple ways of handling this. You can either do, like I said, async await, which will make it almost like a traditional JavaScript application where you have stuff. And when you get to that async await call, it will literally wait before going on to the next line. So it's a little bit more predictable in that sense, right? The issue with that, obviously, is that if you want stuff to run in parallel, like if you don't want stuff to hold each other up, you have this, optimization issue. So architecting around that can become very complicated. And that's the whole point. Like it's hard. Promises in programming are hard. And in web development, especially because you're dealing with so many different API layers, you're constantly dealing with promises. Like 90% of the code I write is inside of a async await, honestly. Now, how to make it easier for yourself a little bit? Learn the JavaScript event loop. Learn what promise chaining is. Learn some common patterns for error handling. Error handling in this space is a little bit complicated because like every API sends back completely different errors. And so you might have to essentially, read the docs. Very important. Read the documentation of the API. What kind of errors is it sending back? Figure out how to handle those errors. The reality is you have to program. Like you have to just go in and write code and screw up a lot and figure out which path to take and have stuff, race conditions happen that destroy your application and then write better code that solves that. You have to just code a lot. But learning about like the core infrastructure of how JavaScript handles asynchronous programming, again, event loops, promise chaining, and stuff like that, async operations, that's going to help you get a good base to work on that from and help you move forward with it.
I was actually going to say with this type of stuff, I mean, I tried to get into this stuff by just getting into it. And what I mean by that is I meant, okay, I've kind of maxed out my, let's say, basic JavaScript knowledge a number of years ago. So let's get into promises. Let's get into, synchronous, asynchronous, those type of things. And you certainly can. I mean, we've just discussed it. Mike just told us about it. But one thing that I did notice about myself was that I was reading this stuff, but it was kind of going over my head, not in complexity necessarily, but just in sort of a way of like, when am I going to use this? Why am I going to use this stuff? And what actually helped me was just like what Mike said, is just to start writing code. The thing that sucks about it though, is usually what happens is your app, which is seemingly airtight, just breaks for some reason. Like there's a timing problem, right? Where you're expecting the number 1 to be returned. Your function that expects that is running in 1 second and it takes 2 seconds to return. So now there's a problem, right? And you're just like, like what's happening? And you have to try to get that function to wait or delay or this or that. And those type of things can also be affected by the performance, meaning the computational power of the device that they're running on as well. Network speeds and stuff like that also affect this type of thing sometimes. And so this is when you start getting into this area. And it's like, at least for me, it was really difficult for me to tell that I was entering this zone. Like I said, I kind of went through my era of trying to dive in and learn it in almost like a theory way, right? Kind of giving myself a lecture, if you will, from like a university or a college perspective. And just sort of reading into it was sort of like, okay, I need to get into the real world and do this. Months go by. I hit one of these problems. I don't even realize I'm bumping up against this stuff, this asynchronous programming and promises and all the rest of it. And then I keep looking it up. I think it was you, Mike, that actually told me, hey, you should be doing a callback here. This thing's not returning fast enough, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, this is what's happened. I've breached this thing. And so that is one thing I just want to say, like from a personal perspective, like it does really suck when you bump up against this stuff, because honestly, like your apps at this point, right, are usually simplistic. They grow and grow and grow in complexity. And then eventually you hit a situation or a complexity level in which you need to use one of these methods, or you hit one of these problems, timing issues. And then you're like, uh-oh, now I have to really start thinking about how this stuff is run. I can't just sort of have functions and, vars and lets and all kinds of stuff kind of all over the place like I would normally do in a simple program. I have to start taking more things into consideration.
And that's a perfect segue into state management, because you cannot have vars and lets and const all over the place and maintain like state across different components and your whole entire application. As an application grows, state management becomes more and more complex. And this is a little bit, in my opinion, one of those web development things where we've solved this problem 15 different times for 15 different use cases when one is fine. And yes, you're pigeonholing some things here and there, but you could still use it. Like, for example, to pass data between components in a Svelte application, right? You can use something called a store. Right? That's fine. Like a store is kind of a global object that you can pass back and forth between components, and it'll update dynamically between all those components. If you update it once here, it'll update across everything else. Great way to handle state management. Well, there's also context providers. So then you can have a parent component pass a context into a child component that essentially does the same thing. When the child component updates it, the parent knows about that update, and it can pass into multiple different children. But then the complexity there is that if there's two child components, you can't really use context. Well, why not just use store in that case? And then now you're using context and then store, and you're managing state in multiple different ways. And then you're like, well, why don't I just not even worry about that and just pass in props because it's not a complex state? Now you're managing state in 3 different ways. And then you're like, well, what about just putting your global variable in this random file over here and just referencing that global variable haphazardly across different components? And then you're managing state 4 different ways, and et cetera, et cetera. You just start to get to the point where you're managing state so many different ways that itself becomes a state management issue. So this is why I think state management is hard, is because, first of all, managing state can be difficult. Like, you can accidentally change one thing that affects another, right? By accidentally naming something the same if you use global state, and that'll break your entire application. And just handling the passing of information between different elements of your application has to be thought about, so you don't get into this loop of using every possible state management solution out there and overcomplicating something that could just be using one solution, really easy to read. Yes, maybe it's slightly more inefficient. It goes back to that, like, you're saving nanoseconds if you're using this more optimized state management protocol, but really you're making it more difficult for your other developer to read, or, a year down the line for people to debug. So sticking with a state management solution that works across your application, using the simplest one you can possibly use for this particular use case, that's really the advice I would give here to make it easier for you. But know that it's not super easy to get there unless you've architected your application in some way, shape, or form. You've thought. Now, architect is a more complicated word. You just thought it through. Like, how is this timer over on this page going to interact with this, like, other thing that's got to show maybe that timer as well, or it's got to interact with that timer, right? Like, maybe your dashboard has a timer and a page and a separate page has a function that will ding if that timer elapses, right? You're not on the dashboard, but you're still using the dashboard's data. Just think about it. Just think it through. And when you're creating your state management solution or choosing your state management solution, again, maybe a store is all you need if you're using Svelte. Just my kind of 2 cents on state management.
Just to sort of build on this, I mean, my comments are going to be more about sort of the architecting, I suppose, your application or your website. But, like Mike, you had mentioned that it's very important for state management to do so. And I would honestly say that this is another one of those topics where really kind of getting into the weeds and having a messy application that suddenly, you sort of hit these roadblocks like, oh my God, I don't know what state I'm in. I don't know where these, bits and bobs are. I don't know where this variable is. I don't know what is happening. I don't know what's happening, right? You're all over the place, right? I think that as you just sort of make applications and make web apps and stuff like that, your first few at the least, and probably first several, to be honest, are going to be pretty messy just in general. And then you're just going to slowly start to think, at least this is how I learned it, was I slowly started to think about architecture stuff. So I would say, you know what, I had like 3 timers, 8 delays. I had about 4 functions and, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And, I'm done that application. I'm not going back. I'm not refactoring, but I remember it being a mess. I remember it being a mess of like what was delayed and why, and how do I track that? And where are these things? So you start thinking to yourself, okay, maybe we should have a couple of these global variables that are tracking where things are. And what we'll do is, we'll make sure to isolate and insulate all our other variables, but we'll have, 2 or 3 global ones, because you don't want to have a million global ones typically. We'll have 2 or 3 of these global ones. And then at any time, any part of the application can quickly check what's going on based upon the value of these variables. And maybe we'll have, one function that sets delays, and, we'll just pass it the amount of milliseconds or the amount of seconds that it needs to create a delay for us and things like that. You'll start slowly but surely architecting it. One of the earliest moments I can remember doing this actually is we did have, or maybe do have, I don't know what the status of it is, a Chrome app called Multiple Accounts for Outlook.com, where, back in the day, you couldn't have multiple accounts signed in to Outlook.com, specifically the consumer version. And so I basically utilized the Chrome apps, and I was using Chrome apps on Windows at the time. I basically used the Chrome apps ability to kind of effectively have these individual tabs that had their own individual sort of browser cache and history and stuff like that. So then I was able to log into each of these, like, let's call them quote unquote individual browsers. And then I just had a UI that would go through. And one of the things I remember architecting was I was trying to architect like sort of a display name and a name and this and that. And I thought to myself, you know what, this is a very, utilitarian application. This is a very utilitarian thing. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm not going to have a display name, I'm not going to have this and that. I'm going to tie everything into an ID, and I'm going to force the user to enter in a unique ID for each of these accounts, right? So like personal, work, whatever. And I limited the characters they were allowed to use. I think I limited it to dashes and letters or something like that. It's been a long time. But then I used that entered data as the ID. And I was able to say, okay, this is my ID. Now I'm always going to flip to this browser because I'm also like saying that this browser, browser 1 has this ID, browser 2 has this ID. And it just made everything much simpler than all this sort of spaghetti code that I had at the time. Again, this was pretty early in my career, but all this sort of spaghetti code I had at the time just sort of melted away, right? I didn't need to deal with all these display names and corresponding display name to name and this and that. And in today's Matt brain, I suppose, what I was doing was not that hard. But it is just an example of how slowly but surely I like kind of start thinking and go, you know what? It's going to be easier if I architect it this way. And it's my app. I'm architecting it this way. And it's just sort of like a maturing, I suppose, of your programming knowledge.
That's exactly it. You got to mature, like, and you can't mature until you hit these issues as well. Like, that's the thing. I'm hoping that us telling you about them will at least give you a preamble when you start like, oh, I see what they're talking about when you start hitting the issue. But don't be afraid to just code and make mistakes and hit the issue yourself, because that's the best way to kind of understand what we're talking about at that point and have that aha moment. Again, hopefully it's not going to be as bad as what Matt was saying with like, oh, I didn't know what it was with the asynchronous programming. Now you'll at least have a baseline for what it is, and you'll be able to go and be like, okay, I need to learn asynchronous programming a little bit more. So it's kind of, this is the purpose of these episodes, is to give you that kind of concept, a baseline for you to understand where you're lacking when you actually hit the point of lacking it. Security concerns. That's the next topic here. This one's really important in my opinion, and something that's taken not as seriously in web development as it should be. A lot of the existing hacks, the current hacks that are happening across the web start with bad implementation of, authorization and authentication. If you don't take it seriously, you're going to end up with these hacks that happen where people go in steal people's browser cookies and are able to log into any people's accounts and take all the data. And you get into this point where almost every large company at this point has had data breaches. Now, not all of those are caused directly from a web development vulnerability. I want to make that clear. A lot of them are like something in terms of social engineering. Someone got, access to someone's server and got all the data. Like that happens a lot too. But a lot of them are also just, hey, they were able to find an attack vector in a website on a login portal, able to log in through some sort of SQL injection or potentially a just admin password left alone and stuff like that, and able to log in and get a bunch of data, right? So you have to take this seriously. There's a few key things in web development that you need to take seriously. One is cross-site scripting, where a user is able to essentially inject JavaScript into a website that will run for other users and steal people's information. Cookies are typically what people are looking for in this. Another one is cross-site request forgery. This one essentially will allow people to pretend like log in without being actually part of that website. You have to make sure that your login cookie when people are trying to log in is coming from the correct domain, not from a third-party domain. It limits the attack vector on actually stealing logins. There's a few others, but realistically, I would highly recommend you to really pay attention to security. Maybe ask people to try to hit your website before it's in production. Ask for penetration testing. If you're building something that's mission critical and that's storing user data, pay for an audit. Pay for an audit, right? Like if you're storing critical information, medical records, God forbid, like whatever, just take that extra step, pay for an audit. It might be expensive, but if your company is serious about security, which they should be, this is something you need to do, right? This is like absolutely crucial to stop this bleeding of data. Like we have to stop every single piece of user data being out there and free to go and no consequences for that as well. Like it's really getting to me. Security is really, really important.
It really does suck too. Like, I mean, it sucks that we have obviously bad actors that are trying to get in as well, and so every single time an attack vector is found, it's sort of like, a wake up call to not only the person that was attacked, but also everyone else where it's like, oh shoot, we might have that attack vector as well. We may have that vulnerability. Someone could SQL inject into our place by doing this, we need to change. Mike, you mentioned social engineering. We need to change how we handle social engineering. We may have to have some training. We may have to have very, very strict limits, whether it's based upon people being choosy or literally the IT coming in and changing how emails or what emails are allowed to be, sent and read and opened and how files are opened and things like that. I mean, we've seen people get attacked by opening a PDF on an email, which is crazy. Like that's a crazy, attack vector that you would never think of, and how many times have I just opened up a PDF willy-nilly, right? How many times have any of us just been like, what's this PDF? I'm not interested in this offer. Meanwhile, it wasn't an offer. It was an offer behind the scenes to get a keylogger or something installed on your computer. And now we have, one heck of a problem with our hands. So, security is something that, you absolutely need to take seriously. It's really difficult. So like what Mike's saying is if it's, if security is paramount, do have someone take a look at it, a security expert, have a good look at it. Make sure that you do as many best practices that you know how to do. Because here's the thing is when none of us are perfect, even if we do the best practices, there's going to be a time where you slip up or you forget something. And so just trying to adhere to the security best practices and doing them as many times or as well as you can, helps, obviously, right? You don't want to be just willy-nilly going in there being like, I hope this is secure. Try to do your best. And then if, you didn't understand one or two specific cases that could have been attacked, at least it was only one or two cases, right? Or you got sloppy once. Now there's 2 or 3 ways into your app, which isn't great, but it's better than 100 ways into your app because you're just running around doing whatever, right? And that's the unfortunate reality. I know that some people get really, 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 really pissed, perturbed by security problems, and they are a problem, but they, blame it all on the IT department. And so I am sympathetic in a way because it's like, and not only just the IT, but the developers, the tech staff behind it, right? Where it's there is a point in which there's a lot of attack vectors. There's a lot of new ways to get into things. Then there's always new ways being invented to get into things. Like the PDF thing, like I said, is crazy to me. And it's just like, there's so many ways that our devices and our apps and our sign-ins are connected now. So it's like, you're just not going to necessarily notice something, and things are so fast too. You can't be like slowly being like, is this secure? Do I open this? Let's ask the IT team. It's not realistic. And so I have sympathy for places that do have a security problem because, it sucks. Just recently, one of our email clients, we have someone that's we host email, they got hacked. They emailed themselves and it was on their end, like they had a virus or something on their computer. So that this program went into their email client and sent out about 14 bajillion emails and ended up getting our frickin' email permissions from the host revoked until we could explain ourselves. And, that sucks, right? And that's a security hole that I can't fix or anticipate. That's on someone's computer. Now, thankfully, that person doesn't have access to any admin stuff or whatever. And, it was his fault. Like he got a virus on his computer and that virus accessed his client. So it's, that security problem in that particular case is not on us, but it is an example of, that's a weird attack vector that guy is not the guy that called me. Somebody else called me and said, hey, I can't send emails. I'm like, what? I go look and someone's like, yeah, by the way, this other dude's been sending about 14,000 emails. What are these? I go look at the logs. That's all like gobbledygook, like all clearly machine generated. I'm like, okay, this is clearly like he's been compromised, in some way. And it ended up, like I said, being a virus. And it's like, that's so random. Like some dude that I've never met has a laptop or a computer or a phone somewhere that's been injected, and it affected someone else, on some other laptop that I would never, and we're a tiny company, right? So I do sympathize with those that have to deal with security, right? Like I do think that the public does need to have like a little bit of patience. I totally understand why you wouldn't. Like I'd be pissed if my SIN got leaked and things like that, 100,000%. But like, as long as the company is doing their best, like there's always going to be someone trying to get in, and it's almost impossible to stop it all, if not actually literally impossible. So just like I said, just as a quick reiteration, do your security best practices the best you know how. And if something's really paramount security, do get an expert to take a look.
And like some suggestions as well, like store the minimum amount of data that you need to actually function in your application. Don't just automatically store everything that you could possibly take just because you want data. Store less data, and that means it has less impact if it does get leaked, right? And then next, build using tools. Like if you don't know how to create your own authentication platform, right? Like that's not a trivial thing. Like I know people say like, oh, you should roll your own auth. It's easy. It's like, to do the basic stuff, sure, there's a lot of like documentation on it. You can do it. But there's also a lot of really good audited open source projects that are used by thousands, if not thousands of developers that have been tested by thousands of other people that do the job. And one that I'll recommend is Lucia Auth. It works with every framework at this point, I think. It is fantastic. Pilcrow One Paper is the creator of it. I'll have a link to their Twitter account, and I'll also have a link to the book that he wrote called Copenhagen. This book, I've read it. It's short. It's all open source on GitHub. Really good fundamental knowledge for stuff like resetting passwords, stuff like authorization tokens, databases. Really good fundamental knowledge. I highly recommend checking out this book. It's really easy to read. And I always go back to it when I need to, like I just recently implemented a reset password recovery form. And I went back to it and I noticed a couple things that I didn't do. And I implemented, and now my reset recovery form is even more secure. So like, definitely use industry standard things when you possibly can, right? Without having to write your own, unless you're an expert in the field, right? If you're an expert, maybe makes sense for you to roll your own, but rely on stuff that has been tested thoroughly.
I do actually want to add something there, Mike, because this is a conversation I have with clients all the time. And you mentioned, just gather the information that you need. And a lot of clients will just be like, let's let the users make accounts and let's collect their email and stuff like that. And here's the thing. I know that the sort of the meme or, whatever you want to call it, the the state of mind today is, oh, all this information is getting collected for selling, right? That's true in some cases, right? There is information that gets sold, whether it's legal or illegal. There is information that gets sold or traded or whatever, or given to companies. Here's the thing. The clients that we deal with do not have that in their agenda, as far as I know. Not to mention, they wouldn't even know how to access the data they're asking me to collect. And what's really, really frustrating about that is it's always a fight to push back on it. Because I always say to them, why would you want to have user accounts all over your thing when all you want them to do is purchase, say, golf tournament tickets every year? Many companies have a little golf tournament for charity or for themselves or whatever every year. And they're like, yeah, just like, let's make a whole login system. Let's do this and that. And I go, hang on. Why would you do that? Like, what are you using now? Oh, we're just kind of selling over this. It's usually like an in-person platform or like over email, right? And it's like, well, is that working? Yeah. It's like, well, then why? We're not spinning up a whole thing where like on the website proper, there's a login portal just for everyone to log in once a year. And then that security has to be constantly upgraded and updated. Like, that's crazy talk, right? It's like, go to a vendor, use a vendor, like use like, Tion or something, like whatever program. There's programs out there for golf, for tickets generically, there's ways to sell things online. Use those, because yeah, they charge, but so am I. I'm also going to charge. If you have people logging in every day and you want a very custom checkout experience, then maybe. But even then, we commonly will push people toward the big boys. Like, hey, you really should, like the big guys, meaning the big payment partners, they've taken over the space, and for good reason, because we're talking about security of like a login portal. Well, imagine a login portal that gets you into everyone's personal data and their payment data, right? Like, even more security worries. It's like the big guys, WooCommerce, Moneris, Stripe, and then some of these go through additional partners as well, through specific banks and things like that. Like, these are the big guys in the space, right? And there's many more. These are the big guys in the space. And there's a reason why they're big, is because it's literally, in most cases, not worth rolling your own. Like Mike said, roll your own off. It doesn't make sense to sort of like roll your own payment stuff, especially if it's seasonal, and especially don't collect data just for one time a year. The amount of times I've had that argument is probably 4 times this year, and I've had it several more times. Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes.
Crazy. Yeah. Like, I mean, don't roll your own payment provider. Very good point. Like, don't ever roll your own payment provider. Don't do it. Don't do it unless you get a team of 50 engineers that all have 10 years experience in payment providing. Don't roll your own payment provider.
For a seasonal one-time purchase, it's like $50 a person.
Don't do it even if you have a million purchases. Don't do it. I'm saying don't do it.
100%. I agree.
Don't do it. Don't do it. Okay. Next thing here, performance optimization. Now, this one's tough. I'm sure Matt will have a lot of feedback on this one, but essentially, web applications are meant to run on everything, right? They're meant to run on computers. They're meant to run on laptops. They're meant to run on phones, tablets, watches. I don't know, like anything with a screen and an internet connection is supposed to be able to run a modern web application. Now, this is where optimizing for performance becomes very important, because you don't know what your customer's device is going to be. A lot of times with mobile apps development, you can even set limits, right? You can be like, hey, I'm not going to support iOS 7. And then you know exactly what devices people are going to be using, the worst case scenario. With web development, you have no freaking idea. Now, you can technically set limits in certain ways, being like, oh, if you have this network connection, just don't use this, I guess. But that's not usually how web development apps are created or made. You're making it for everyone. So it becomes inherently important that your app loads quickly. It becomes important that people can interact quickly. And it becomes even more important when marketing gets involved and comes up with statistics like if someone doesn't if the page doesn't load in the first, I think it's 10 seconds, 80% of the users will drop off. And then everything becomes chaos to the point where you have to do everything possible to load that page in 10 seconds. Otherwise, marketing will blame you for every single dollar lost. I speak to this from experience. Trust me, it's usually not the developer's fault. I'm going to tell that right now. But the reality is you have to be the one that fixes it. Now, luckily, there's a lot of tools that can help you. And there's a lot of strategies that can help you make a really performant website and a web application. You can do stuff like lazy loading, code splitting, caching, right? You can use tools like Lighthouse and Web Vitals to see how your site is doing without having to launch it into production. Like, there's a lot you can do that can help you create a really performant web app, but it still requires a lot of work. And it's not just work in the sense of, hey, I need to write better code. It's work in the sense of I need to make sure that there's no big files, there's no big images, there's no big font, there's no blocking scripts, right? In your head tag. Like, there's just so many coding standards and practices that you have to follow, as well as other stuff surrounding content on your website that can affect performance in millions of different ways. The framework that you choose, right? Like the tool that you choose, Webflow versus WordPress, React versus Svelte, that can affect performance. Like, every choice you make has an effect on this part of it. And that makes this really complicated.
The whole marketing thing, where marketing is going to blame you for bounce rate, is such a huge argument. I'm on a project right now where this has been a problem since probably the beginning of this year, maybe even late 2023. And I've been arguing with the owner of this site for so long. This particular person will not do keyword research. They will not do any sort of heading hierarchies. They will not do any sort of heading hierarchies for SEO, or at least that's what I call it, where you take a look and you go, let's try to get some more, keywords in here. Let's try to, answer some questions like the people always ask in some of our main headings. Let's have proper heading structure like H1 through H6. And usually it's just H1 through H4 approximately. You don't really need all 6 usually. Argument after argument after argument. And all this person cares about is that their performance is sitting at around 70 and they want it to be higher, but they want all of these images and these pieces of information pulled from the database. And they want this like super nice editor, and they want the editor to be visual and make it look nice and this and that. And so it's a miracle, honestly, that we got it to even be 70. This thing was running, because we didn't do any optimizations, this thing was running at about 30, 34, 28 sometimes. We're talking mobile on page speed insights. And now I got it up to about 65, something like that. And then another developer comes in, he gets it to about 71, and just being just pounded by requests about how critical this is and how this and how that. Meanwhile, the motivation behind this request is actually due to traffic. This person wants more traffic, but they won't do any keyword research. And I've tried to show them, hey, on some of my websites that are mine, not client ones, I haven't done any optimizations. I haven't checked the page speed. I've just put them together. They're just for fun projects. I throw them up. Hey, they load pretty quick. Cool. They don't take 7 seconds to load each page. Cool. And I'm surpassing his traffic because of keyword research, because of some SEO. And this person will refuse because they see on these SEO tools websites, or they have an SEO tool themselves, and they just say, no, these are errors. These are problems. There's this, there's that. So performance optimization, as a whole, you need to have stuff that's performant, right? Use WebP, maybe start to use AVIF. I'm still on the fence about AVIF. I think it might be a little too early. I'm just not sure yet. Use caching if need be, right? compress your images, make sure they load nicely, lazy load them, load some scripts, async if you can, defer them if you can. I'm totally there for making things load fast, right? But when you're at the point of splitting hairs, this is where performance optimization, the rubber hits the road, where those things I just mentioned are pretty simple. They're pretty easy to do, right? Maybe the hardest thing to do would be making a facade for a YouTube video where you make a facade show up, which is just an image with a play button. You click that, then a light box opens, then the embed loads, so you're not waiting for YouTube to load that content, right? That's probably the most difficult thing that I just said. And if you do all these things, your website in real world loading usually passes the Core Web Vitals. Wait a couple months, right, for it to do its thing, 28 days, however long it takes PageSpeed Insights to do that, and you'll usually pass Core Web Vitals. Not always, but usually. The problem comes in is then these people, these clients, they want this last little bit. Meanwhile, they're clearly messing up on another part of the strategy. And to squeeze performance out of something that's heavy by design, because the actual website has a lot of media, has a lot of stuff, to squeeze the performance out of it when there isn't a plugin available to help you. And this is, in my particular case, there's no plugin that can help me with this. No, or at least I shouldn't say that. There's no free plugin, and I'm not allowed to do anything paid. There's not in the budget, so I have to do everything manually. This is a waste of time. I'm just going to say it. It's a waste of time. I know that some people will say, yeah, but the bounce rate will increase if the loading. Yeah, you're right. But people do wait a couple seconds for sites to load. People are aware that if they're not in a great area of reception, that things take a while to load. You know why they're aware of that? Is because they might go, screw HTML, all the things. It took 5 seconds. I'm going to NHL.com. Damn, NHL.com took 8 seconds. They're aware. It's clear. They're in a slow area. They have slow internet at home. They're in a bad reception area, right? People don't just bounce these days. There's a generally accepted thing that sometimes websites take a while to load. And I'll say this. I've run tests on large websites, large media websites. I'm not going to name them, but just go to a big media hub with your ad block off. Your computer will spin up. The ads are playing. There's 4 videos auto playing. There's something tracking your scrolls so that Ford can tell you about the all new something. It's ridiculous, right? It's all over the damn place. There's a lot of performance hits on these things. Run that site in PageSpeed Insights. Take a major media outlet. Run that. Sometimes you get red, 28, 32, 18 in PageSpeed Insights mobile specifically. And it's just performance matters. Performance does matter. But when you try to argue these numbers of people are bouncing because of this, it's that's not necessarily true. You can't just take an SEO thing that was said and apply it to your thing. Totally apply it as a test and go, I wonder if people are bouncing because of that. And then work through it and apply it to your project. But these people that are typically in marketing take these statements and they treat them like they're the end all be all, oh, this is going to tank us. This is going to destroy us. We'll never get any visitors. Meanwhile, when they talk or interact with people that have been on their site, not a single person goes, man, that site ran like garbage. Man, I had trouble loading it. No one says that, right? So again, you can talk to me about this because I know some people are going to say, all your sites should be green, this and that. Sorry, but people don't have the budget for that. And I'm not doing performance optimization for free. And some people also want stuff oh, I demand a 4K image. Well, the performance is going to be bad. I demand a 4K image and it better load quick. Can't, sorry. Not on a slow connection. If you have a 4 megabyte image, not going to load quick. Sorry. Period. What do you want me to do? I can cache and make subsequent refreshes faster, but if you literally want a 4K image on your page, I cannot help you. If you refuse to compress your images, I cannot help you. So a bit of a rant, but this is a real thing. And I'm sure that anyone out there that's been a freelancer, worked in an agency or something like that, has had these arguments with people where we're fighting for 4 points on Google PageSpeed Insights. Meanwhile, they're delaying the writing of their next hopefully great SEO thing, or they're not keyword researching in the background. They're just kind of willy-nilly publishing pages and hoping. But it's oh, it's all you, man. You're the bounce rate. You're the problem. Am I the fucking problem? Come on. Ridiculous. Ridiculous.
Yep, ridiculous. Yep. And yeah, it's never going to stop, but it's something that you have to kind of deal with. Okay. Next thing here.
I'm
Scalability.
I'm sweating it up here now. Fuck, sweaty.
He's fired up.
Fucking
Matt is fired up.
Should have a man. There should be a video podcast. I should have a hat, meaning HTML the things towel. You can sell the hat towel. Fuck, wipe my face just in case you get fired up. Fucking in a Zoom call, man.
Well, let's get fired up about scalability and architecture. This one, obviously tough. Just saying the words, I feel like people might cringe at what we're talking about. But you think like a regular website, you throw it up onto like a shared host, you're good to go. The problem comes in with a web application that's supposed to be accessed by hundreds of people simultaneously, thousands of people maybe, accessing the same database all at the same time, sharing that data without any sort of lag or any sort of data like, conflicting and stuff like that. Like that becomes much more complicated. And that's where the web is right now, right? Like we're trying to make these massive applications like Linear, Monday.com, all of these huge apps that are used by thousands and millions of people, sometimes simultaneously. Figma is a really perfect example of one. That is an extremely complicated application. That's an entire design platform that can be used multiplayer at the same time by I think hundreds, if not thousands of people. And you can see each other's cursors and you can interact with it, and changes happen in real time. And you're doing these crazy graphic things where you're changing something in one area and it's all of a sudden changing in 100 different areas, right? Like it's very complicated, resource intensive application that's happening on the web. And that's where the scalability and architecture becomes very, very difficult, right? A simple application, you can do it. One developer has probably no problems doing it with modern web apps. That's what makes this easier, is that if you're just trying to do a proof of concept MVP, there's plenty of tools out there that can help you manage database optimization, load balance your database and your servers, do caching, do CDN, stuff like that. Like you can use Vercel. It can scale for you at a cost, but it can scale for you to thousands of users. Not a problem with load balancing and all that. You can use stuff like PlanetScale. It's a database service that also can scale. It can do sharding. It can do everything. It can do caching. It can do a ton of stuff in the background for you, so you don't have to write all that yourself. Okay? There's plenty of services out there now in web development that make this easier. Where it becomes not easy is when you need to go to that next level. When you're that developer that creates that application that's all of a sudden being hugged to death by Reddit or something like that. And now you're looking to build out a team, and then you need a DevOps person, and then you might need a database guy, and then you need these people still. Just because these tools exist that obfuscate it for you doesn't mean that eventually you're going to hit a point where it's this like graph where initially that tool makes sense from a cost perspective and a simplicity perspective. But at some point, that tool that you've used is going to start costing you so much money. And it's also going to have some sort of overhead potentially that will limit you from scaling to a certain point, that you're going to need to either switch to a tool that's, brings that curve back down, or build out a custom solution that takes into account your design problems and creates a more scalable architecture specifically for your use case. And that's when you'll probably need an expert, which will cost you a lot of money initially, but will eventually save you money down the line because you're not paying your crazy AWS bill or your crazy Vercel bills and stuff like that. It's that complication of adding a separate layer onto your application just for being able to scale to millions and millions of users. Now, thankfully, if you're building your own application, most likely you're not going to hit this. Like, hopefully you're building for a niche. I mean, if you do hit it, maybe it's a good problem to have, right? You have millions of users. Now you can get to the point where you can hire people. You're mostly going to be building small applications, internal tools, intranet tools, right? For internal usage of a company. Those tools don't need to worry about that as much. In fact, I would encourage you to not worry about it when you know that your cap is how many people are in your company, 200 people, 300 people, 1,000 people. That makes it very easy for you to plan for using stuff like Vercel, using tools that will do the scaling for you to a certain amount for a very low cost and not have to worry about overhead. Really think about this stuff when you're starting to build your tool, right? It's okay to utilize platforms initially to get it running, but if your anticipation is that you're going to have millions of users in week 4 of launch of our application, maybe that's the indicator for you that Vercel isn't the thing, right? Like maybe that's the indicator for you that, hey, I probably need to architect this. Maybe I need to have a database architect on staff. Maybe I need to have a DevOps person that can handle server management on AWS on staff. That's a very obvious indicator for you that you need to build out your team or your own skills to be able to match these challenges.
I would like to say something too, just sort of about the general landscape these days is that, kind of free data online was a kind of a great idea, I guess, back when Google Photos was like, yo, man, just upload whatever you want here and we'll just compress it a bit and it's unlimited and it's free and it's this and it's that. Those free data days are gone because there's so many people using data that, our digital footprints are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's also more people on the planet, which is, digital data, it gets housed physically somewhere. It's easy to forget that somewhere or sometimes. And so bandwidth is not cheap. Bandwidth is a big part. Storage space is a big part of web development, among other things. And, something like a service like Webflow just lowered their bandwidth limits by a lot, by a fair bit, or I'd say a lot, actually. My personal opinion is by quite a bit. I mean, yes, they gave a statistic of something like, a heck of a lot. I think it was like 93%. Don't quote me on that. 93% of people don't hit these limits, and you're able to, have surge protection and purchase. So there's like a framework on how to handle bandwidth behind there. But, big websites might be hitting bandwidth limits. And it's something to consider if you're like, oh, shoot, I was on this service and now the bandwidth costs this much. What am I going to do? Am I going to leave? Am I going to switch to a new plan? Can I afford the new plan? The list goes on. And so, having scalability in mind is really important these days, especially in particular. Obviously, when you're using a cloud computing platform that isn't just charged per month, but per use, per second, per whatever their billing structure is, you got to watch it, right? Like if they're charging per megabyte delivered and your client decides, well, I'm not going to compress any of my images. They're all going to be 300 kilobytes. It's only 300 kilobytes. It's less than a megabyte. Well, 3 users go there and you're approaching a megabyte now, right? Only 3. What if someone refreshes and the cache didn't cache or whatever, right? And it redelivers an image. I mean, I quite literally had this problem this week where someone almost hit their bandwidth limit. Go and look, everything else is super low. Like everything's well below a gigabyte. And this one image was quite literally going full bore, took up like 70%. Might have been like 80 or 90% even. I don't remember off the top, but a very considerable portion of their bandwidth for the month. I had to go in. What's the size of the image? 360 kilobytes. Why is it so big? I shrink it down to 25. Sure, the quality went down, but not that much. Upload it. Person didn't even notice. There comes a point where it's like, okay, so these little things, like compressing your images and stuff, is really important. And what is another thing I'd like to point out is that a lot of the time when a site is beginning, project's beginning, it's kind of chaotic, right? It's almost like a startup almost in a way, right? And everyone's panicking, everyone's kind of running around. And so you think, oh, I'm going to like fix up my images later. Actually, seriously do that. I know it's kind of like I'll do it later. 2 years down the line, you start compressing your images, and now you have 2 years of blog posts where they're uncompressed images. This might come bite you. If one of your articles goes viral, like if 1 million people hit something, if 1,000 people hit something and it's a megabyte, like that's gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes, depending on how many images and text and other scripts and stuff that you have loading. It is like bandwidth is not free anymore. It's not cheap anymore, arguably, and the price is increasing at the moment. And there's certainly some services that have free tiers and things like that. I fully understand that. And it's still very, very affordable. But you do not want to have to go back and compress like 1,000 blog posts worth of like cover images and this and that and change the pain. It's a real big pain. So think of that in terms of your scalability. It's the number one in my small sample size of clients. It's the number one killer. I've seen WordPress crash, sites go down, hitting limits on hosts getting really pissed off, prices skyrocket, all because people will not take into account their bandwidth and especially their images. You got to compress those things. You got to size them up right.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to propose something a little bit different for the HTML Things podcast. I think this is going to be a 2-parter episode.
This is a good episode so far. Yeah,
there's a lot to talk about left. We still have like 7 things left. I want to talk about one more. And then I think we're going to save the next 6 for a separate part. So let us know what you think about that. We're going to have a 2-parter here. There's a chance we might just release the second part as a blog post. So that's another option. We don't know yet, but I think this might be a 2-part, one of the first 2-part episodes, if not the first 2-part episodes of the HTML Things podcast. So the last thing we're going to talk about, here is cross-browser compatibility. This one is difficult. It's gotten better, right? Like people still complain. Let's be serious. People complain about Firefox. People complain about Safari. 100%. Some of those complaints are valid, but as compared to 5 or 6 years ago when we had Internet Explorer, obviously the most infamous one, right? We had Opera, which was running on its own engine as well. I think Opera is Chromium now. There was just more differentiation, and the difference between them, even like the difference between Safari, Chrome, and Firefox at that time was even more significant. And what do I mean by difference? Well, stuff like certain CSS properties wouldn't work across browsers, right? So you couldn't use things like grid for a long time because even though Chrome supported it, stuff like Safari didn't, right? Same thing with Flexbox for a long time. You couldn't use these integral parts of CSS that we have now back in the day that we could just use them. Now there's some edge cases that you can't use, right? There's some differences how Safari handles view height versus how Chrome handles view height, for example, still, right? There's some certain situations where very edge casey things just don't work the same way. And yes, this is still a problem and it's still a little bit difficult, but I tend to think that this is going away for the most part, right? Browsers are starting to communicate a little bit more. Browsers are starting to compete with each other harder to the point where most of them are pretty feature equivalent. I don't know how you feel about that, Matt. Like, have you had serious issues across browsers lately?
No, it's better than it ever has been, and in general is getting better. One thing that I actually mentioned very briefly in this episode but didn't really dive into was AVIF, which is AVIF, which is I would call it a new image format that's sort of, I guess, positioned or is attempting to sort of take out WebP. So WebP is sort of the optimized browser, web format, and AVIF maintains quality and compresses even further. I find, especially in complex images. Only done a little bit of testing, so none of these sort of results are definitive. However, I saw on Threads the other day, follow us on there by the way, but I saw on Threads the other day that somebody was complaining about, hey, I can't get AVIF to work on my one client's Safari. Like, what's going on? And it was like, oh shoot, I have an update in my Safari. And so I went and I looked because I'm using AVIF in I think I'm literally using 2 AVIF images somewhere. And so I went and I looked here and I got Can I Use open up here and it's for AVIF. And Safari 16.1 to 16.3 has sort of that like not green. It's sort of like the yellowy green, sort of olive, I guess, green thing here for partial support. This is crazy. Released in October 23rd, 2022 to January 22nd, 2023. So realistically speaking, I know that people should be upgrading their browsers, updating their browsers, but it's really possible for someone to have a browser that's 2 years old, right? And it says right here, partial support. Supports still images, animated image sequences are not supported. Only available on Mac OS 13 Ventura or later, which if someone's using an older MacBook and they can't get Ventura, boom, you're done. Does not support images with noise synthesis. And right after that, it's then supported, right? On Safari browser, on Safari desktop browser. But here's the thing, Safari on iOS is different. So there's a flag here. It says it's supported, right? Supported in the last 4 content boxes here that represent the different versions. But in the latest one, so this was 18.1, it says here the note is that supports still images, animated image sequences are not supported. And it's the only one here out of all the big ones, like Firefox for Android doesn't have that. UC browser for Android, you know what that is. Opera Mobile doesn't have that even. Samsung Internet doesn't have that. Chrome for Android doesn't have that. But Safari, iOS, still for AVIF does not support still images, even though this is considered like fully supported AVIF. And I've never messed with AVIF with moving images. Like I've just used like still images. So maybe this is like really, you know, weird or something, or no one would really do this. But it's still something to consider if you have clients that are running an older MacBook or do not update their stuff. It's not crazy for them to have a browser from, like I said, early 2023, only has partial support on desktop. If they got an older MacBook that cannot upgrade to Ventura, that's something to consider. So little things like that will be a thing. Now, you know, that's pretty good. AVIF is pretty cutting edge, I'd say, right? You could totally use WebP. You can have WebP, you're going to have a great experience, whatever. You're going to have a great compression, whatever. This just may be the next big thing. Fair enough. And like it even says here that AVIF competes with JPEG XL. I've heard of JPEG XL literally once. This is the second time. So, you know, at the end of the day here, we're no longer fighting over like, oh my God, this, you know, is Flexbox, which is like a foundational layout technique. Is this supported, right? Those kind of days are more or less gone with a few exceptions. There's a few like sort of little niche things. The last note I want to say on this is like, when you get really into the weeds, like you have a really complex layout where you're like, this is this percent, this is that, this is this, lots of dimensions. You know, this is 10 pixels, that's 4. This one's always 4% over here, but then it's 2, you know, VWs over. Lots of things, usually in a bento section, I find. I will have random problems on a single browser. Usually it's something like Safari or Firefox. It might just be how I code because I code in Chromium Edge, but I usually have a problem in one of those, but only in a really, really, really complex like layout where there's just a lot of like little nuances. And it's usually something like, oh, this bento is not 3/4 of the way width. It's actually 100% width. So it just makes the other one wrap. So it's not the end of the world, but if you have a specific design, that's kind of where I hit those limits.
Yep. I think that is exactly it. Like, Can I Use, you brought up, is a perfect tool actually to kind of help you make sure that whatever you're using, if you're using some random CSS property that you haven't used in a while or something like that, or you haven't used before, it's a good idea to just do a quick check on Can I Use. So I'm going to have a link to Can I Use, caniuse.com. Like, you don't have to follow it. You can just type it into your browser. Definitely a really key tool if you're going to be developing websites. But yeah, this one, I think it's hard from a perspective of it not happening very often now. And when it does happen, it does get pretty complicated. Sometimes like media player issues happen across browsers. Sometimes that one is still a pretty serious one that we've run into.
Major pain in the
recently.
ass. Major pain in the ass.
Yeah, there's some events that don't fire across. Anyway, the media player, like the video player or the audio player, can be a huge pain in the ass across browsers still to this day. And those issues are actually very difficult to solve. Like when it's a CSS issue, usually you can just replace a CSS property with a different one. You should be, for the most part, good. But the JavaScript, the foundational like API layer, those being different, tough.
I mean, just a friggin' full disclosure, like we were going to have a custom podcast player in Webflow on our website, and I built the thing. It worked perfect. And then I went to Safari and I read the docs like a million times. It's like, if I click this once, it should toggle. So it'll go toggle to like play, pause. This was years ago. Maybe it's changed or updated now. I'll be honest with you. That thing didn't toggle. Like it didn't play, pause. It just played once and then stopped and never worked again. I don't know what was wrong. I tried everything. I tried different methods. Worked great on Chromium. Worked great on Android. Didn't work on Safari. So I had to just scrap it just because, you know, I wasn't going to spend a lot of time. I was just trying to, hey, can we do this for fun? And I couldn't because it wasn't fun. So those problems still exist, but it's when things, layouts, or interactivity, it's a good mention, Mike, or interactivity like interacting with audio files. That's when things start getting complicated. And when things get complicated, the browsers can interpret things a little different. Percentages, especially, like I always find, it'll be like one browser will like assume I'm referring like in relation to this. And the other browser will be like, no, in relation to this other thing. So it's like, oh, now this is way too big or way too small. Those are the little problems that I find here and there. But I think this is it. This is the end of this episode, part 1, I suppose. Again, might be a blog post, might be a part 2. I think it's going to be a part 2. Honestly, we've had I think it's a pretty good episode, so we can continue with the last 6 or so items. Maybe there'll even be a couple more that come up, from now and then, between now and then. But it is time to end this episode. And before we do that, remember that you can support episodes like this on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML. All the things just like these fine people did, such as Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And remember, if you think you should be on this list because you've paid, I do reach out on Patreon's messaging system. Go check that out. If you're like, hey, did Matt, forget me? I did send out a couple of messages here and there to some people. If you don't care, that's fine. Totally ignore it. Just letting you know, just in case you're listening to this. And that's it. That concludes this episode. So feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform. Oh, wait. Moment of silence. Last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael LaRocca is the blog author at selftaughttxg.com. Now it's done. Now it's over. Leave a comment or review in the platform you're listening to this on. Spoke like an auctioneer there, and we are signing off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things Podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.